listening to all the stories today about digital technology and so on and be presented with this wonderful retro clicker. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you all for coming to the graveyard shift. Who in the room has been to Antarctica before? Ah, fantastic. And how long ago?
2008.
2008. And the one word that pops into your mind to describe your experience down there?
Otherworldly.
Otherworldly. Yeah, it's a fantastic place to go. It's a tiny bit expensive, but then again, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Now, the only thing is that that's my colleague, my old colleague, Mark Zawaki's presentation called The Mobile Revolution. That's not my presentation. I didn't realise that until just now. I know Mark very well, and his presentation's wonderful, but that's not my one. So that was on that stick I gave you.
And I gave it back to you.
You did? I could go and get it if we needed to. You don't think it's been loaded? Excuse us, guys, while we just sort this out in a moment.
That was the one we loaded, so...
Right, okay, just 1 second. Victoria, tap dancing or otherwise entertaining our guests.
The penguin. You don't get to win him, but you can name him. Steve was telling me earlier that on the journey where there was for the Antarctic reenactment of Shackleton's expedition, that one of the guys who actually did the reenactment home whenever young son and said,
was a white-blue wilderness, a place that was going to be quite desolate, that perhaps you might see the odd penguin or whale, but that was likely to be almost like a desert, which I'd driven through before, like in Death Valley in the back end of LA. But that's not how Antarctica is at all. It's otherworldly, and it's also just teeming with life. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is, for me, that was the last 8 weeks of 8 months away, having taken another opportunity to step out of my corporate role and shoot through to have an experience of wandering around in the wilderness with all the time in the world in my hands, no obligation to do anything, and the opportunity to really go anywhere. So what I'm going to share with you is a story of my 6 months, briefly, in France in the last 6 months of 2012, and then the 8 weeks down in Antarctica and Patagonia this year. That'll be fun on the film, ducking back and forth to the other room and so on, won't it? And as I clarified, that's entirely my fault. So, it's not a white-blue wilderness. But let me start in a different place. The world right now is still a very dangerous place, whether you're in Oklahoma, Boston, you were in the Queensland floods or the Melbourne bushfires. You go online and can have your identity stolen any moment when you're doing all this wonderful digital e-commerce shopping and so on. 2 years ago, I ended up having a little tangle with Cyclone Irene there, Hurricane Irene as they would call it, over in the Bahamas. And Antarctica is a pretty dangerous place too, particularly for penguins that choose to swim with leopard seals. And also for polar explorers who choose to push themselves to the limits of their endurance and end up stuck on the ice and eking out survival for 19 months, as Shackleton did. But let me ask you, where do you think is the most dangerous place in the world for a CEO? Sorry? The boardroom? People are getting that right today. The Australian boardroom, in fact, 24% of all CEOs in the ASX 200 lost their role there in 2011. So for me, over time, I've seen many CEOs falling victim, just as the penguin did, to the jaws of death. Because the rate at which we're able to transform our organisations isn't keeping pace with the demands our customers and employees are placing upon us to transform our proposition to the market, our own internal operations, to transform our culture, and to be able to look after customers in the way they demand to be looked after today. So if we can't change our organisations at the rate we need to, then my proposition, it comes down to us as senior leaders to be able to renew and adapt our skill and capabilities much faster than we've done in the past. I've known the odd senior executive or two who's felt that once they've made it to the executive suite, not Annalee or Paul Sainsbury or others I know here at AMP, of course, they've felt that they can sit on the shelf above the law, blow the whistle and direct traffic, and that their learning journey is kind of over. And that's no longer the case, I don't think, for any leader. We need to be able to continue to adapt and renew our skills even faster. And to me, the best way to do that, and we can see, not even Google or Apple made the top 10 list that Fast Company, we were in the architectural list, not the very top list, but 10 other companies beat Google and Apple out of Fast Company's most innovative list this year. So if they can't even make it, then I suggest that one way we can do this is to just go and get lost. Spend some time in the wilderness, risk your career, and give yourself the opportunity to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror at who you've been, who you've become, and who you want to be in the future. So that's what I'm going to share with you. You can, anyone here gone off to live in a foreign country and had to learn a foreign language to be able to survive there? Yeah. Where did you go to?
Beijing.
Beijing, okay. Where did you go to?
France.
France. And your French is now parfait?
Well,
Not anymore? And was that a tough experience to survive in a foreign country? Not too bad. Maybe you made some friends and so on, but it's kind of one way to do it. You can get dumped by a partner on SMS or perhaps by email. You can fall ill or have to nurse a loved one through a difficult experience, as my cousin's going through at the moment. You may get made redundant these days, and it can happen pretty quick. By 10 o'clock after the phone call, you can find yourself on the street. So rather than wait for that to happen to me, I chose to actually tear off to France and down to Antarctica and Patagonia for 8 months. And I'm just going to share with you the story of that experience. But first I should tell you about Sir Ernest Shackleton. Who's heard of Mr. Shackleton? Most people? Great. And did you see a little bit of the press around the reenactment of his journey in January? So that wasn't me. That was my nutcase colleague, Tim Jarvis, who I admire immensely. And we ended up tangled up in the support team. But firstly, just to share with you, so Shackleton lived in the age of heroes, and he decided that Amundsen having beaten him to the South Pole and others to the North Pole, that he would do this one last crazy journey. And he would try to land here at Vassal Bay, and having sent another party around to the Ross Sea side, he would attempt to actually cross the entire Antarctic continent via the South Pole, taking enough provisions from this side to get to the pole, and then miraculously picking up these food dumps through to the other side. As it turns out, he never even touched land. His ship, the Endurance, was beset in the ice here, and then ensued 10 months where they lived on the boat on the ice until it was crushed and sank. 5 more months they lived at their aptly named Patience Camp, waiting patiently for the ice to begin to break up, at which moment he decided to launch the 3 lifeboats that they had salvaged from Endurance, and they made it across to a desolate chunk of rock and ice called Elephant Island. It smells like penguin poo like you would not believe. And from there, they were still dead as a doornail, and he chose to take 5 of the strongest men and the best of the lifeboats and attempt to sail, as I showed you a moment ago, 1,500 kilometres from Elephant Island here to South Georgia, where you have to basically land on the wrong side of the island because of the prevailing westerly currents and breezes, and the little lifeboat doesn't have a keel. So if you tried to round South Georgia, you would just be dead. And my colleague, Tim, in his enormous wisdom, decided he would recreate that journey authentically in a replica boat with old Burberry clothing and celestial navigation, and even forcing themselves to eat pemmican, which is a pretty horrible kind of beefy jerky that you can stir up with a bit of milk and water in what they call a hoosh. And in the end, he'll have to tell you in the book whether they ate that the whole way or not. So, getting back to my story, so in January I needed to drop into my boss's office and say I was going to bugger off to France for 6 months. I wasn't quite sure if he would tell me at that moment to get lost, or whether perhaps the firm might be willing to hold my post open for me. And despite my being a little bit frightened as to how he might react, he was a pillar of support and helped me negotiate an appropriate arrangement with Arup. And I could go off. My wife was lucky to have 6 months of long service leave with Sydney Grammar, so she had no trouble getting the time away. And then come about June, we were ready to go. And just prior to leaving, I got an email from Tim Jarvis, and it talked about this crazy expedition, which I'd known was coming. We, as Arup, decided to sponsor it alongside St George Bank, Intrepid Travel and Discovery Networks out of Europe. Later it came on board to make a film about the expedition. And despite me poking and prodding different guys and ladies in the office in Sydney, I couldn't find a single person willing to sign up for the support team. So I thought, well, who's going to care if I'm away in January, February anyway, and put my name forward. Once we got over to, because I wasn't going to see that as a lost opportunity for us to be involved. So come July, we're packing our bags, my wife and I, getting ready to do the Chemin de Saint-Jacques-de-Compostelle, or Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St James, as you might have seen it in the recent movie. But this time in the French language, in the French culture. And just as we're packing our bags, I got another email. Now, I was really pleased to see that it mentioned Tim's expedition in our global bulletin, Arup News, but a little shell-shocked to find my name there as part of the team, particularly because I hadn't actually kind of really told Kerry yet that I was going to be away, that it was at my own expense, that I had to take another 8 weeks leave without pay, and I would, you know, while not being in any life-threatening danger, as you'll see from my perspective, be away from her, which I don't normally like to do. Anyway, I threw together a fundraising page, as you can these days. I'd read about Kickstarter and other things and thought I'll give that a try. I don't, as my colleague Andrew up the back there will probably acknowledge, I don't really like to ask other people for help, but I didn't have a choice. And I was amazed to find that in the end, I got quite a bit of support, which was lovely. So December 30 then, after our 6 wonderful months together in France, I took off to go down to Chile and to fly into a place called Punta Arenas. Now, you'll note I didn't say Punta Arenas. And I learned you say it Punta Arenas, okay? It's much nicer. And having had a little bit of turbulence on the way down there, having landed in Punta, I went first to the church and then to Shackleton's bar and then back to my hotel. Because has anyone been on a plane where you've had that kind of general level of screaming throughout the bulk of the cabin? It was one of those times when I thought, maybe this might be the end. But in the end, it was cool, and I said my prayers accordingly. Having decided then we were safe and sound, my colleague Donald and I, who were actually in the advance party in a way, we weren't quite sure what was happening next, and soon we learned that's how expeditions go. You never know what's going to happen next. And while we were in the supermarket trying to prepare for all eventualities with wine, chocolate, croissant, and anything else we could find on our way down to King George Island, I got an email from Tim. And that's what it said. I'll just let you read it for yourself. It's quite a strange email to get, really. But it turns out that 15 months on the ice that Shackleton had squirreled away 15 kilograms of nougat and 2 bottles of whiskey from the 27 men in his command. Can you imagine what you would have done for a bit of nougat or a drop of whiskey? So miraculously, Shackleton had squirreled that stuff away, and Tim wanted to do the same. So using our local interpreter, we found out nougat is turon in Spanish, bought as much of it as we could carry, and took it down to Antarctica. We flew down and had a couple of days at the courtesy of the Chilean government. Now, you might be aware about the Antarctic Treaty. It's a kind of agreement to have no agreement until 2041. And what that means is everyone just does research in Antarctica. No one's pressing any territorial claims. No one's making any military kind of bristling moves about how they want to, push their own barrow. And nor is Chile at all. They only have a permanent Air Force base with an airport, a permanent naval base around the corner, and they do lots of research. So we were very lucky to spend some time with these fellows in the Air Force who were great cooks, and an opportunity for us to see some of the elephant seals and other bits and pieces while we waited for our colleagues to arrive. So January 8, after we'd been delayed for a further 2 days by some very bad weather, the guys finally came across on Australis, the support vessel from Ushuaia. And as you can see on this, it's too small for you to see up the back there, but this is called the Drake Passage, the gap between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. And it's the wildest piece of water on Earth. The westerly winds and currents tear through this gap, and either when you're crossing, you either get the Drake Shake or the Drake Lake. One or the other. And these guys ended up with 80-knot breezes and were delayed 2 days and had to wait off around the corner before they could come and pick us up. We got to fly, so it was cool. And then we were all there. So we've got Tim and his 5 insane colleagues, half of which are British, half of which are, 2 are Australian and 1 of which is Kiwi. The sponsor crew, 5 of us from Arup, 1 from St George, 1 from Intrepid, and 1 fellow who actually won a competition in Europe that Discovery ran. Jo, the blog mistress on the top left there, who you would have read her blog along the way. She did a magnificent job under incredibly trying circumstances. And the professional crew of Australis, who were fantastic people, and ended up calling Sky No Limits, because she just was the most amazing cook known to mankind, or personkind, I should say. So I'll just skip through now and show you some of the eye candy, and we can have some more time for questions later. This is the Polish base on King George Island, which Tim used as his base. We dropped them off here. We saw the little Alexander Shackleton lifeboat, which was still in its crate. It was out in the open where it really shouldn't have been. The idea was it would be inside and not being exposed to all the elements. But anyway, it still floated, so that was cool. So we left Tim behind to find all of his expedition equipment, some of which had gone missing, complete their sea trials, try and capsize the little boat and find out what would happen, while we took off across the Bransfield Strait to the Antarctic Peninsula. And we were lost in paradise. We saw more humpbacks, killers and other stuff than you can imagine. It's like entertainment on steroids. And these guys, the 3 professional crew, would stop the boat in a heartbeat any moment that it looked like there was an animal, a seal or whoever to hang out with. The ice takes incredible shapes and forms. There's even an iceberg graveyard, which is a beautiful place, but pretty eerie to be in. Sort of Weddell's seal having a snooze while the killers are not more than 10 metres from him or her. More of the iceberg graveyard. We wrote ourselves in the snow rather than having a flag. And in the meantime, Tim and the crew were finishing off installing the camera rig to the boat. There's 680 kilograms of battery as part of the 1 tonne of ballast in the bottom of the lifeboat that helps make it more seaworthy. And that was enough to be able to power the camera rig 24/7 for the entire time they were at sea. We had a chance to get on and do our Shackletons Way program, which you can find out a little bit more about on the web. It's based on a book called Shackletons Way by Margot Morell, who we've been dealing with, who came down to Sydney in May, and we did the course together. And we took our time. We did it over 5 days. We didn't want to kind of stress ourselves out too much. and slotted the tuition in between while watching Sky's fantastic cooking and the other nice things we did. It was funny that, maybe we can talk about this later, that whether we liked it or not, we created a bit of a Shackleton environment among us. So it was pretty nice that there was a sense of fairness, there was an optimistic mindset. It didn't matter what went on the vessel. People supported one another, and we behaved pretty well together, partly because I guess we were talking about all this good Shackleton stuff. People talk about Shackleton being a mother with a Viking's heart. He pulled up short on one of his expeditions rather than put his lives, the men that were with him put their lives at risk, saying that better a live donkey than a dead lion. And Hurley here, the Australian photographer, he's talking about Shackleton in just the sort of terms that really mean he's the kind of leader we'd all like to be. And the Shackletons Way book and stuff I can commend to you as a great resource to learn a bit more about that. As I mentioned, we had no real hardship at all on the support vessel. We had gin and tonics here with 10,000-year-old ice from the icebergs. We had wonderful cooking from Sky, and there was a little red here and there. Leopard seal putting on a show for us. And then we got back to King George Island, and Alexandra Shackleton was all ready to go. Tim had to plan out how to use every square inch of her. And once they were ready to go, we had an opportunity just to play on the little boat a bit. The way Tim describes it, it's like 6 people my size were going to live under your average dining table for 11 days. And for example, when they went to put on their dry suits, which is a one-piece suit that they did have just in case there was a dire emergency and they might get the chance to deploy them, they took a long time to put on in that environment, potentially too long to be of much use. So we had to give the expedition support vessel back to Tim and the crew to take across on their journey. We went up to Patagonia, and I won't spend too long on that, but it was another magnificent experience. It's hard to say the Torres del Paine or the Fitzroy Mountain are a bit of a kind of letdown after Antarctica, because they're not. They're magnificent places. But to run into 10 other people and stuff was like really annoying. So after the first week at sea, things weren't looking great for Tim, as you may have seen in the press at the time. They hadn't had a sun sight, and they only had their compass and sextant for navigation. So they were not looking great. But long story short, and you'll be able to find out more about the story in the film and book that Tim will release later in the year. It's called Endurance in the Wake of Shackleton, the working title of the film. They ended up getting a sun sight, didn't get lost at sea, and were able to make the crossing in 11 days in some weather that was a little frightening. And having crossed the 1,500 kilometres at sea, they were then pinned down in King Haakon Bay here where they landed, just as Shackleton did, for 3 full days by some really bad weather. And then they got the chance to try and cross, and just 3 of them made it. Paul Larson is not shown here. He was crossing in this modern gear like this. I only wear this because otherwise it's like a wedding dress. I'd never get to wear it again, you know. And Tim and Baz were in their traditional gear, which, as he said, the only performance requirement these things could meet is if you wanted a sponge in future. They were pretty useless. And it took 3 days to cross. Shackleton made the crossing in 36 hours. He talks in his book about the fact that with the 3 men, sometimes it felt like there was a 4th walking alongside them. And Tim can empathise with that because he took 3 days and Shackleton had been stranded on the ice for 15 months before he attempted his crossing, which he did in 36 hours. So, March 1, we get back to Sydney together. Tim obviously has lost a lot more weight than I, meaning I put some on. And I had some time to reflect on the experience and really, I guess, the whole 8 months away. So without being too deep and meaningful at this late time of the evening, I'll just quickly touch on that and then we'll create some time for questions. So the first thing was to, while you see a chance, take it. Many years ago, an uncle of mine created an opportunity for me to interview with a little mob in New York that doesn't exist anymore called Lehman Brothers. And I was lucky enough to decide to go and grab that chance, and that kind of took me in one direction, which I later did a U-turn from, I assure you. But this was an opportunity begging there in June to put my name forward, and it really validated for me again the opportunity of grabbing things put to you that might seem a bit unexpected, might seem a bit risky at the start, but I encourage you, if you get a chance, to grab it while you can. On the Camino, when you're walking 800 kilometres or in other times like in Kilimanjaro, you need to just keep walking. Not in a stupid way, sometimes your body is going to tell you to stop. But bloody-minded persistence goes an enormous distance, particularly in a market environment like we're in at the moment. So that's my second message, is about bloody-minded persistence. But with the third one, being willing to actually recognise, especially with some of the amazing young people I work with, that often other people will see things I don't anymore. Most unfortunately, I approach the same birthday as the firm Arup does this year, 50, which is depressing and entirely inappropriate in my mind. But these young people see stuff that I just am never going to know. So be willing to take on board their advice. Have patience and courage under fire. The guys the professional crew of Australis, they go back and forth across the Drake 10 times a year and put themselves in the face of 80 and 90 knot breezes, and they do it with wonderful courage, and at the same time they know when to wait. So I learned from those guys, patience and courage under fire is important. Enjoy the unexpected, don't whine about it. On an expedition, Tim often talked about it being like keeping up a house of cards in a gale. And sustaining that temporary organisation for 4 years was an enormous effort. And so he took us through a lot of unexpected twists and turns, and in the end you need to embrace and enjoy them. And believe it or not, at my ripe old age, I do honestly think that I've learned that I can become more creative as I get older rather than less. I was a chartered accountant one day long ago, and even did auditing for the first 4 years. So it doesn't get much worse than that, does it? But nonetheless, I'm now able to do some other things that perhaps I didn't think I'd ever do. So the moral to the story is, don't stand still, it's really dangerous. What you could do is take the opportunity to lose the self you are today, and take the opportunity to find your own future. One that might be quite different than you may ever have imagined. There's lots of ways you can find out more about Shackleton and the reenactment that Tim did. There's books and so on I can share with you, courses you can do, and it's a wonderful story to take the opportunity to immerse yourself in. So with that, this is a little quote that Shackleton wrote in a guest book in Punta Arenas after he'd rescued all of his men. And I'll let you read it for yourself. It's a bit mad, but it's quite lovely. Okay, so it says, "We were the fools who could not rest in the dull earth we left behind, but burnt with passion for the south and drank strange frenzy from its wind. The world where wise men sit at ease fades from our unregretful eyes, and thus across uncharted seas we stagger on our enterprise." So that just reminds me I don't want to be a wise man sitting at ease. Okay, I've gone a little over.